Thank you, Mara, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak with you today. The issue of HIV prevention is very, very important. We have made great advances in treatment, and treatment helps prevent new cases. However, it's going to take HIV prevention and future technological advancements in HIV prevention to really make a difference. I'd like to talk about those today. My disclosures are I've done work with Gilead Sciences, Research and Honoraria and Speakers Bureau, and the same thing with ViiV Healthcare. We know that the power of PrEP is very significant. You can look in real life in cities and see a range of reduction in new cases from a low of at least a third back almost 5 years ago in Sydney to almost 60% in San Francisco from 2012 to 2018. And so there is no question that PrEP has made a significant difference in the landscape of new infections for HIV. And this impact is not to be lost, but rather is to be built upon. The data, when we look at some of this data in terms of its effectiveness in different genders, and it's been shown that with oral pills, at least with Truvada and researchers ongoing with Descovy, that we can show significant declines in new infections and protection, as you see in the percentages listed here. And so it's based on this kind of work that we're building our next generation of efforts. The first thing is to think about, instead of taking PrEP on a daily basis, there's been work done in France looking at the role of sex-driven or event-driven, and this is called IPREX. And this is very interesting to patients, especially during COVID, where perhaps they're not having sex as frequently as they used to. And so they don't want to take a pill every day. And so the ability to customize this to their lifestyle is something that's greatly appealing. And so the basic rationale for this is you take 2 tablets of tenofovir and emtricitabine 2 to 24 hours before sex, and then 1 tablet the day after and 1 tablet 2 days after, and for a total of 4 pills. And when we look at the effectiveness of this, it's broadly as effective as taking it on a daily basis. So this is one thing that's unique about oral PrEP, especially with Truvada, because this hasn't been tested with tenofovir alafenamide and emtricitabine Descovy in clinical trials, but with Truvada, to use it on an event-based occurrence. Now, that being said, the challenges of taking PrEP on a daily basis are significant. And so Raphael Landowitz has recently reported on the results of the study HPTN-083. And the purpose of HPTN-083 was to analyze the use of an injectable agent, an injectable integrase called cabotegravir. And the first is both groups were on every day of an oral lead-in, and one group got placebo. The other group, after the oral lead-in, got injection for weeks 5 and 9, so in a more regular basis, about every 4 weeks. And then after that, every 2 months for approximately 3 years. The other group got the placebo injection and took Truvada every day. And then the intention was step 3, they would follow this after they had discontinued the injections for at least a year. That tail of treatment, that continuation of oral, even for the people who were on injectable cabotegravir, was necessary because the blood levels wane of the injectable over time, and so you need to use the oral agent to prevent any breakthrough as the levels get lower. Well, this study was terminated prematurely. You can see here the randomization schedule that about 2,300 patients were randomized to each arm, and there were a small amount of people infected at enrollment, but approximately 2,250 in each group. And as I said before, I'll go over the demographics a bit more. There were 4,500 cisgender, MSM, and transgender women who have sex with men were included in the analysis. The average age was 28. About 2/3 were under 30, 40% under the age of 25. And I want to stress that this recruitment was done so that it would mirror the population who's currently getting infected in the United States. 12% were transgender women at enrollment, and half of the patient were African American or Black of those enrolled in the United States. And as I said earlier, this study was discontinued prematurely by the DSMB. And it was discontinued because there was an imbalance in the number of new infections. And what happened is there were 52 infections total in about 6,400 years of person follow-up, but there were 39 infections in the TDF-FTC arm and only 13 infections in the cabotegravir arm. The hazard ratio was significant for favoring cabotegravir. And this significant difference was enough to terminate the continuation of the study, and it was stopped prematurely because these results showed that injectable was that much better than Truvada. Let's take a closer look at the data so we can understand some of the architecture of that response. What you see here is just a Kaplan-Meier curve showing, again, another way to look at these. And you can see that the breakthroughs occurred predominantly after about 48 weeks. And so they occurred in the 1 to 3 year range, and even at a higher slope in the 2 to 3 year range, suggesting, I think, to those of us with some inkling about it, that the effectiveness or the relative comparative effectiveness of the two regimens changed the longer that people were on these regimens, suggesting that adherence might have been responsible for some of the differences in the poor performance in the oral agent. When we looked at the 39 infections in the TDF and FTC arm, there were 3 that happened in the oral lead-in, but the majority occurred later on in the study. And so the majority all occurred later. When we look at the 13 infections in the cabotegravir arm, there were 2 that occurred prior to the first injection. But these are a little different kind of pattern of failures. The group in yellow, the infection after a prolonged hiatus, are people who stopped for some reason taking the injection. So there you have approximately 4 patients that the injection just didn't work for because people didn't take them. 3 other patients got infected during the oral lead-in. So either there was adherence issues or some issue around PK with oral lead-in that we can't really distinguish, but it wasn't the fault of the injection. And in fact, of the 13 failures, only 5 of the 13 failures failed while actively on continuous injections. So this is a very low rate of failure for close to 2,300 patients over close to a 3-year period. When we look at the DBS levels for the group on tenofovir, you can see for the most part that adherence was pretty good. In fact, the group that was at 2 to 4 doses, which would have been the group that was at risk, you can see all the way out at 81 weeks only made up 15%, suggesting that close to 65, 70% of the people were taking adequate amount of doses. And when you look at the plasma tenofovir levels, 87% were greater than 10, 75% greater than 40. And this difference of lower tenofovir levels were only a little true as you got later on, as we said, and you only see it, you start to see it after about week 17 to 33, but for the most part, it stayed pretty good. But there was a small group of patients who didn't seem to take all of their doses, and you can see that group increasing from 6.2% in week 17 to close to 13% in week 81. When we compare this to IPREX, we see that when people got to levels, looking at people off of PrEP and the risk of new infections, that at 4 to 6 pills, you had very little breakthrough. And so we know that the group, if I go backwards for a second, only the group that we were really talking about in that at week 57, 12.3%, at week 81, 12.8%, and a little bit of the group in yellow, the 7.5 and the 5.1, that had less than 2 doses a week, and just edging into that yellow. So those 3 colors, other than the different colors of green, were the area here in IPREX that we might expect more failures. And so we understand that predominantly the failures that are seen in the Truvada arm did not occur because Truvada was not effective. Truvada was very effective. It was really when patients weren't taking their medications. When we look at the adherence levels on the in 083, not in other studies, in this one you can see that among subgroups there was greater issues of non-adherence. In the U.S. participants, you can see that 61% of African Americans had less adherence. In Latin America, you saw less adherence. And in the TGW, the transgender population, there were low adherence. So lower adherence was not shared equally among the population, but among different populations it seemed to occur on. This is relevant to help us focus, I think, future efforts on how to support the adherence of people on oral regimens, but it still speaks to the Achilles heel of oral regimens. When we then look at the other side, well, what's the downside of taking these injections? And you can see that there was about 20% of the people had mild injection site reactions all the way through. and a higher amount in the early weeks. You can see that it wasn't until you got to well, close to the 18th, 19th injection that it got less than 20%. But these injections, for the most part, were mild with a few grade 2s. And for the most part, people were tolerant of it and didn't withdraw. In fact, only 2.2% of the people who got these oral regimens discontinued because of these adverse events. So though there was some reaction to people when they got the shots, they didn't discontinue therapy as a result of it. And when you look at the adverse event reactions not related to injections, you can see for the most part, they were quite similar with some small changes, a decrease in creatinine clearance in the TDF group, but a small percentage, a small increase in blood glucose. We don't know why that is. A small increase in pyrexia in the cabotegravir arm, presumably relating to site reactions. But for the most part, these grade 2 adverse events, which were reported in greater than 5%, were minimal and shared for the most part between the two groups. Now, one of the issues around the use of PrEP lately has been the concern about weight gain. And this compares the weight gain that you see with cabotegravir compared to TDF-FTC. And what it shows you is that from week 0 to 40, you had a 1.54 kilogram gain in cabotegravir, and the TDF arm, about a 0.5 kilogram loss. In the second and third years, from weeks 40 to 105, that weight gain overall was 1.07, so it started to level off, and the TDF-FTC got to 1.06. And so there ended up being a small increase in kilograms in the group on cabotegravir, the integrase, compared to TDF-FTC. But in general, this gain was not that significant. When you looked at the cabotegravir versus placebo, you can see that the weight gain was similar, again, in both groups. So weight gain doesn't seem to be that big of an issue for this approach. I'd like to move on to some other agents. Certainly, the issues around cabotegravir, the company manufacturer ViiV will proceed, I would assume, with approval of this in various municipalities, and the distribution of this hopefully will start occurring sometime during 2021. There are other agents on the horizon. I'd like to speak about two of them. The first is lenacapavir, a capsid inhibitor. Capsid inhibitors are really about preventing the protein shell, the outer shell of the capsid, when the virus gets released back into the circulation to infect other cells. So it affects both the disassembly and the assembly of this protein shell. And by inhibiting multiple processes for viral replication, it's very stable in terms of its risk of mutation, and it's very potent as well. What you can see here is the antiviral activity at different dosages went from a log drop to a 2.3 log drop over a period of 10 days. When we then look at the PK dynamics, and this is looking at oral and subcutaneous, you can see that this stays above the area of IC50, where we think it would be very beneficial for a high period of time, upwards of 4 months. And so this gives us a lot of excitement as to how infrequent the dosing could be, either of a subcutaneous injection rather than the IM injection of cabotegravir, which would be easier and patients could self-administer. And so that's why this begins to be more exciting. Both the route of administration as an injectable is easier, as well as the frequency between injections might be less. We don't know yet. Another agent, which is a novel NRTI, a nucleoside reverse transcriptase translocation inhibitor, is a very exciting agent. This agent is a translocation inhibitor which prevents the opening of the RT nucleotide binding site, and it also is a delayed chain terminator. So it has two different modes of action, and this multiple mode of action also prevents its development of resistance and gives it extra potency. So it's similar into lenacapavir in that it has two different areas of functionality, but it's very different. And this is a nucleoside agent, and it's oral, but it can also be given subcutaneously. This is looking at this in a monotherapy single dose oral regimen. You can see here that the viral load reductions was quite similar to what we saw with lenacapavir, getting close to 2 logs. The adverse event profile of this agent, which has now been tested in oral patients, comparing it to tenofovir, was quite reasonable and quite similar to other agents. And so it had a very good toxicity profile. Lenacapavir is further, islatravir is further along in its development than lenacapavir. When you look at changes in weight, because this is clearly an issue that's affected the field right now, we see low amounts of weight gain that we're seeing with this, similar to other agents that were being used similar to TDF. So it's not so different than some of the weight studies we discussed in relationship to cabotegravir. Now, islatravir can be considered for PrEP because it has a long half-life, and it can be administered subcutaneously, it can be administered in depot, and it can be administered orally. And it's felt that if we do it orally, and this is showing you orally, you can see that it's having sustained activity over close to 50 days. And so the current clinical trials are going to look at this in an extended dosing frequency, much different than daily, and probably a once a month dose could be something that would be looked at. And so this is very exciting because now instead of needing an injection or a subcutaneous, which is what would be coming with lenacapavir or potentially with cabotegravir, islatravir could be given as an oral once monthly, or even perhaps less frequently if given in a different form. Implant data shows that we could consider using this perhaps over a 4 to 6 month period with a single implant, much as we see with oral contraceptives. And so we've really started to come to the time that the use of these agents would be much as we looked at with oral contraception. There could be a buffet of choices where people could have a pill if they wanted it. They could have a pill that would be once daily. They could have a pill to be used for event-based dosing. They could have a monthly pill. They could have an implant. They could have an IM injection. They could have a subcutaneous injection. The idea is that with more options for patients, we'll get more buy-in. Patients who are more committed to a regimen are more likely to stay on it. It improves prevention just because of the patient connection and integration into that treatment approach. But it also has agents that are more robust and last longer and have high barriers to resistance, which will further the effectiveness. The final area I want to talk about is the area of broadly neutralizing antibodies. This is an area that's gotten great press lately, as our president of the United States has touted it as a cure for COVID when these antibodies are directed towards COVID, the COVID virus. However, with HIV, and even with COVID, it's not a cure, it's a treatment. But for HIV, it can be used as a prevention. And so these antibodies are engineered and harvested at what's very effective against HIV, and they've been used to be able to prevent HIV infections, and those studies are ongoing. So to conclude, I'd like to say that the biggest advances I can say is that there are now more choices. These injections, either subcutaneous or IM, can provide longer acting protection, cabotegravir being the farthest along, hopefully coming forward in 2021, and can be used for a wide range of populations where we have different kinds of subpopulations that might have more challenges with adherence. The use of cabotegravir has had high acceptability despite having some side effects. And so the idea that patients wouldn't adopt to this, I think, has been disproven, at least initially, by this study, and further real-world data will confirm that. And finally, the evolving landscape as oral agents become once weekly, as subcutaneous injections or implantation technology improves, will give patients more and more options. And more options, I think, will mean more patient satisfaction. Higher patient satisfaction will mean greater adherence, and greater adherence hopefully will mean less HIV infections. Thank you for your time today and your attention. I hope this has been of help to you.